I did not think, nor did I expect that I would talk about the situation around the world. I don't really even want to talk about it, because much has been said about it, and because I'm starting to feel as if words no longer carry much weight, and that they don't have much potential to be useful. Because I sense that any discussion has become almost impossible, that everyone is already divided into groups out of which they cannot be moved. At the same time, the situation is so complicated that no singular person can possibly describe and explain it. Not because there is no origin point or a story to be told, but because no one stands above it or beyond it. But that is ultimately what I have the need to talk about. Precisely about the fact that not a single one of us knows the absolute truth. And so in time of chaos, it is perhaps even necessary to begin where we have at least a bit of certainty. That is, within ourselves, in our very lives. Only we know what we should do in our lives. Certainly no government, no organization, no authority that doesn't know us and to which we are nothing but a statistic and a number know that. At best, it is our mothers, fathers, and those loving us that may claim to know what is good for us. But that's about it. And because of that, I think that in this situation, we should, above all, listen to ourselves and not to anyone else. The pandemic that has taken over the world is not caused by a physical virus, but by a virus within our very minds, which turns them against man himself and which inverts reality itself. It is a pandemic of minds thinking that they know better than anyone else what the truth is. It is a story about our own rational mind convincing us that the truth is something specific and taken out of context, and that nothing else than this one truth matters. And it is this frame into which the whole current situation fits that I have the need to talk about. And I can't begin anywhere else but with myself, as that is where the whole problem ultimately begins, in each and every one of us, and not somewhere in the outside world. My whole life I lived convinced that the most important things I have are the freedom within my own mind and my freedom of choice. That nothing can possibly exist that could ever be able to interfere with my thoughts and my words. That a situation couldn't arise where something could force me to give up the possibility of considering more than one option of how to act and how to speak itself. I never cared much about some freedoms in the outside real world, because that which I have in my mind was always better than that which I could see out there. And so the free movement within my own mind was enough for me, as the world outside had very little to offer. Respectively, it was enough for me to experience very little, as my mind, with its tendency to look through and beyond things, allowed me to say to myself, yes, I have experienced a few manifestations of this one thing. I can see what they have in common and how the thing fits in within the whole, so I don't need to experience it again for the 5th time. And because my brain can identify the defining characteristics of each thing and can from them interpolate its greatest possible manifestation, it is inevitable that it creates an image better than reality. So as the possibilities for movement and action in the world began to be restricted, I personally didn't care much, as it didn't limit me. But it did concern me because of the principle of the whole thing. Because principles and ideas of how things could be were to me always more important than their specific and concrete manifestations within reality. But as time passes, I'm finding that I'm gradually losing this highest freedom of mine, the freedom of my own mind, and that I'm losing my need to never have just one option to consider. And it is not because someone is taking them from me. No tyranny can reach that deep. It is happening of my own choice, because I am becoming ever more acutely aware of some higher truth, one that is above me, above everything. And if a man sees himself as subordinate to such a truth, then he has no choice but to act according to it. And thus, one does lose his freedom. That is why I'm now talking about whatever it is I'm talking about, because I no longer have a choice not to. So, the whole current situation can be framed by what is a fight of left and right hemisphere of the brain. At this point, just one thing is being shoved in front of our eyes, that there is some virus, and that it is this virus which we must focus all our attention on. and that it is this virus alone that is the only thing that determines all the happenings in the world, that it is this virus to which our lives are subordinate. We are being told that a set of a few numbers determines the state of reality. We are not being told this by the situation behind our windows and inside our houses. We are told this by someone else, some authority which invited itself and forced itself into our lives. That which is telling us all this is precisely the left hemisphere and its self-appointed totalitarian tendency. It is the left hemisphere and its way of thinking and looking at the world which is dominant in the present world. The left hemisphere is the one which is looking at the world as if it was an object to be manipulated. And it is this adaptation for manipulation what predetermines it to divide the world into individual pieces that can be manipulated. Elements unconnected to the whole and outside of the whole. It is the left hemisphere what is pulling things out of context and focusing all its attention on them to a point where it is not aware of anything else. It is the left hemisphere what is then describing this divided reality by numbers, to which it then assigns the primacy of being and the highest truth. It is the left hemisphere what requires explicitness and one unchanging absolute interpretation of everything, while ignoring the implicit, the emerging out of the whole. And this whole process and the blindness of the left hemisphere to the whole necessarily leads to the left hemisphere claiming about itself that it does have the absolute truth. For how could it not claim that, when it is literally incapable of seeing two conflicting truths and see how they contradict each other? For it, there is no contradiction, because it knows not of connection either. It is precisely this hemisphere and its way of looking at the world what it has the tendency to ultimately manifest itself as totality. For what else is totality than the belief of a small fragment of the whole that only it can see and has access to the whole truth? A belief that a certain part of the whole is the only and whole truth, and that all must be subordinate to it. What else is totality than the idea that all must be subordinate to something concrete, explicitly given, defined beforehand and unchanging, to something which is itself removed from causality of reality, what is considered to be fixed. It is in the nature of every totality that it proclaims itself as the highest authority superior to all else. It is never elevated to the throne from the bottom. Every totality comes in robes of moral superiority, shielding itself from any resistance by the cheapest means. And then it claims that solutions to all existing problems lay within something already existing within reality and wholly worldly. Totality is then the conviction that nothing unknown exists, respectively, that outside of that which is explicit, defined by a number or a rule or an algorithm, there is nothing. And from the definition of the word totality, it of course follows that totality is convinced that nothing outside of it itself exists. That everything that is outside of it must be assimilated inside or completely expelled from reality. Totality means that everything which is inside of it must also be numbered and accounted for. And it is precisely this assignment of a number or category which makes a thing part of the totality. In totality, everything must have its exact and unchanging place, and everything may only follow already existing rules, or rules derivable from the already existing ones. In totality, there is no space for uncertainty. That is why, if something is not marked and categorized, described by a rule, or defined by way of function, it must be assigned to all of these attributes, and through that, absorbed into its totality. That which cannot be described by a number or an algorithm is removed from reality as if it didn't even exist. Such things are, of course, any religion aimed at anything that is not explicit and concrete. It is anything spiritual. It is freedom itself. And those are also the greatest enemies of any totality, exactly because they can't be grabbed and controlled, for they do not lay within physical reality. In totality, any religion aiming outside of reality is replaced by one that has the state, the science, or the material as its highest judge. Freedom is replaced by, from the top, enforced conformity to a rule set, or by an arbitrary pseudo-randomness. Meanwhile, The only thing that is true of reality is ever-present change and possibility of the emergence of something truly new. The truth is that no single person nor a group of people inside reality can possibly see it whole and thus know the whole truth. As long as one acts individually based on his personal untruth, he shall quickly fall and collide with reality and be able to learn. At the same time, if everyone acted as a free individual, then it would be impossible that masses be pulled to this untruth. But if any structure which is behind it means of coercion acts based on an untruth, and it most certainly does, then this collision with reality is delayed and involves more people. That is why it is inevitable, as totality is nearing its goal, the inclusion of all existence in an unchanging, unlimited framework, that it loses touch with reality. Then the ossified totality is forced into pushing everything towards its erroneous idea by increasingly more force. Then it is these forces acting on an unflexible structure that sends the whole thing down. Reality and true newness have their origin precisely in that which yet isn't, that is in something that can't be described or controlled. The origin of reality is in an idea, in the idea of the possibility of existence of something greater. And only an individual has that. Only free individual making his own choices is capable of investigating the truths relating to the whole of reality. And he shall find those faster than any structures, because he will also face the consequences of his decisions the fastest, and because he will be able to assign to these consequences his truths, choices, and actions. It is because of this ability of a free man to assign to his own choices and actions consequences in the form of the experience of reality that enables him to improve himself. And it is exactly this what totality takes from a man. Totality makes it impossible for an individual to become better, precisely to the degree to which it is itself determining his life and decisions. And it is the goal of totality to ultimately control the entire life of an individual and all of his decisions from one place which is outside of him. If a man then acts based on something external to him, he can't assign the quality of his life to himself, and he then can't but blame someone else for the experience of reality. If a man then acts based on something external to him, he can't assign the quality of his own life to himself, and he then can't but blame someone else for his experience of reality. He can't but continue dividing reality into himself and the others. And the others then must of course become the same as he is, or they must be removed from reality altogether. But if this man went sufficiently back in his memory, he would reach a point where he, in fact, did make a choice that led him to his current situation. And that decision was giving up responsibility for his own life into the hands of another, to some authority or some ideology. And by doing so, man loses his freedom and invites totality into the world. You might now say, how can I possibly equate responsibility with freedom? Don't we give away responsibilities for parts of our lives to others precisely to gain freedom? Why should we grow our own vegetables when we can buy them in the shop and then have more free time to do what we really want? Everything in our lives that we take from the outside only to have time for ourselves. And in the end, we let others decide everything for us and around us, because that surely will give us the freedom to attend to what we really want. We put our whole lives into the hands of others, and thus it is them who are responsible for them. After all, things work, and we are safe and comfortable. Yes, and that is the only thing we gain by giving up responsibility for ourselves. Comfort and safety. The certainty that we may forever stay the same and as insufficient as we are right now. And when we buy the next robot or install the next phone app, which will save us 5 minutes a day and make more decisions for us, then we will finally have the time for ourselves and enough energy to improve ourselves, and we will have the freedom to be who we really want to be. Well, I don't think I have ever seen that happen. By giving over responsibility for parts of our lives, we are in fact giving up our freedom. because then we are dependent on others, and the possibilities for our actions are then in the hands of others. And thus our freedom is then limited by their convictions, their rules, and the goals that they have in mind for us. The hunger for this mistaken idea of freedom is then bringing the whole of humanity at the edge of totality, and so paradoxically to the loss of the real freedom. As to be responsible for something means having to act by one's own intentions and sensibilities, that is, freely. But of course, that also means having to face the consequences of these actions and intentions. And it is precisely the promise of not having to face consequences of one's own actions and decisions what people mistake for freedom. And totality does offer them this promise. Of course, under the condition that they give up their own freedom, the real freedom. After all, if you don't act as free, but instead according to the will of totality, you can never do anything wrong and are thus a good moral person. That simply it is. And so, the road to any higher and more precise truth is the fastest through individual freedom. And no one person has a claim to this truth, because it is shared by all at once. It is that which is common to all. Perhaps it will be better if I make these ideas clearer by the use of a few diagrams or by looking at them from a bit different angle. We can imagine the movement of reality to be the resulting vector of the motivations and intentions of all the actors within it. We may then imagine that there are individuals living within reality, each of them having their own sphere of interests and goals that can be represented by some overlapping curves. If everyone acts based on his own truth, then the final movement of society and reality is the sum of all the individual vectors. And because an individual does not have as much power to manifest changes in society and reality like larger structures, and because he is closer to collision with hard reality than these more powerful structures, and because every individual sees truth in a different direction and area, it is necessarily so that the final vector is rather small, and that society and reality, if they move at all, move at least proximately in a correct and truthful direction. The chance that the whole society goes in the wrong direction is then absolutely minuscule, or, dare I say, zero. But individuals can of course create structures and share their motivations and goals. They can create businesses, corporations, governments. And those have a greater chance of moving the society into a potentially wrong direction. That is exactly because they are based on structures, where a structure is nothing more than a set of fixed rules and dependencies. As such, whenever a structure is erected, people involved in it become dependent on it. And if this dependence brings them any benefits, then they will have the motivation to support and expand the working and the direction of movement of this structure, so that they may continue accruing and securing these benefits. Of course, as long as this structure acts according to some proximal truth, it will also continue producing in their essence good results, and will be able to naturally evolve and grow without encroaching on the freedoms of those dependent on it too much. But success, comfort, and benefits attract ever more people, and so the dependencies deepen. And with that, the whole structure is being increasingly more gripped by the need to keep it going in the very same direction that did at first provide all these bonuses. Then the structure loses the sight of what is true, to the point where it must be maintained by lies, manipulation, and force, only so that those dependent on it may preserve their comfort and advantages. The structure, form of which begins to resemble totality, is then losing touch with reality, and because it is so large, and because so many people are dependent on it, they do depart from reality and truth along with it. And if this structure with totalitarian tendencies is sufficiently large and strong, then it may pull with itself towards its out-of-context removed single truth, to which all must be subordinate, everyone. It is thanks to this structure and dependence on it what enables people and society to get into places where they otherwise could not, because as individuals they would all run into the truth of reality much sooner. But like this, the untruth can even be supported by everyone, and everyone can go towards the untruth voluntarily, because their very livelihood has become dependent on a lie. At the moment when such a structure or totality emerges, Then, as a reaction, a need to fight against it by the opposite emerges. That is, by creating a structure in opposition to the first, with the intention of equalizing its influence. But this purely reactionary creation necessarily creates but a mirror image, one that is ultimately just as distant from truth as the first one. The easiest way of fighting totality is always in the past. There was a point where all one had to do was say but one word, no. But of course, at that point, a man was already a part of society, and his comfort and livelihood were dependent on the existing structures. And so not many had a reason to say no at that point. After all, what the structure demanded was small and almost insignificant. It didn't cost much to conform, but by the same token, saying no wouldn't have cost much in terms of consequences either. And that is what it enables totality to emerge, one demand after another, each time a bit bigger. To a point where saying no or not doing something is not enough. To a point where the consequence of not conforming is not mere verbal abuse, but perhaps the loss of one's whole livelihood. There is only one way how to fight against a totality or corrupt structures when they are already in place. At a point when a word is no longer enough, an act is necessary. But at a point where totality already exists, one can be sure that for his action he will suffer disproportional consequences, and that his action will necessarily completely change all his following life. By that, I do not mean an act in the sense of a physical violent resistance. That I do not consider to be useful and ultimately aligned with truth. By the act, I mean the decision to return to an existence as an individual which is responsible for himself and who is standing outside of these totalitarian structures. An individual in parallel structures which are not sufficiently large so as to be unchangeable by him. The act is to stop making decisions as demanded by structures which he knows to be wrong. The act is to stop acting based on something he knows to be wrong, and instead to begin acting based on his own truth, being fully aware that he shall face consequences for doing so, and that those will be brought upon him by totality. Alternatively, one might simply decide to wait and to survive. But I dare say that while in such a case the body might survive, the soul will not. But wait, he might try. For every totality will inevitably fall apart under the weight of all the lies on which it is based, as every lie demands the birth of another in the future. In the end, every totality must inevitably get to a point where the lies are so many that it is no longer capable of maintaining them in a coherent whole, to a point where the reality, as much as the perception of people is being manipulated with, is clearly different from that being thrust by it in front of our eyes, to a point where it is so removed from reality that it must use so much force to enforce its lies that it smashes itself. And as I have already said, totality sees as essential that it must within itself contain everything, and it believes that nothing can exist which is outside of it. It believes that no such thing as a beforehand authorized pattern of behavior can exist. And as it is nearing its goal, it increasingly prevents anything new from being created, and it makes reaction to change impossible, because it kills freedom itself. And it is precisely free people, those who are willing to go beyond the borders of safety and comfort, who also produce and bring more than is demanded of them. And it is precisely them who get removed by the totality first. From those who remain, freedom will be sooner or later taken as well. Totality thus creates such an environment where without threats and coercion, no one produces more than he needs for his own survival. Enormous inefficiency is also another inevitable characteristic of a totality, because it must use ever more means on maintaining lies and corrupt structures, ever more force and threats and oppression. People longing for safety and comfort will inevitably lose both, but only years or decades after the first ones lost their freedom because no one said no. In the end, totality will begin killing those who until then supported it, and only then will it fall apart. In the forming cracks, freedom will once again be allowed, and those whose bodies survived will once again be lifted back into the sun on the backs of the free, but they shall no longer be able to feel its warmth. It is possible to explain the current happenings even from the point of view of a person's attention. As I have said, the left hemisphere looks at reality and divides it into out-of-context taken small pieces to which it assigns symbols or numbers with which it substitutes the thing itself. Then this symbol or a number is proclaimed to be the truth superior to all else, at least until it is focusing its attention at it. That is also one of the basic principles of the functioning of totality. So, individuals live inside reality, and each of them focuses his attention on that which he finds at the given moment as most relevant. At a given moment, each individual sees as most important for his well-being something else. And so the whole landscape of reality is covered. Of course, most attention is paid to matters spatially and temporally the closest. But, unless another object of attention is artificially pushed onto a person, all things get naturally as much attention as they require. And again, if each of us acts on his own accord and chooses as an object of attention something wrong, then the reality, in its essence a feedback loop, will very quickly let us know, through consequences, where our attention actually ought to be directed. But if a structure comes, a totality, and starts pointing at only one problem, elevating it to the post of the only problem, determining the being of everyone, this feedback loop is disrupted. It is disrupted because they have the power to move attention and other means, and to artificially keep them where they otherwise would not go. Attention is locked on one thing, to which everyone must become subordinate. Everything else loses attention. And if something is true about reality, it is that that to which no attention is paid falls apart. Thus, the economy begins to fall apart, the logistics start to fall apart, the relationships start to fall apart, your own house begins to fall apart. As a result of crumbling economy, your own job and ability to make a living fall apart. On the other hand, the seemingly elevated problem to which all attention and means are artificially moved becomes to many an easy way of procuring their needs. And so a part of the population becomes completely reliant on this problem. It is simply expedient for them that it exists. But above all the population becomes subservient and dependent on the structure, the totality, which is the thing that artificially inflates the problem and keeps it alive by forced attention and means shifting. But totality and left hemisphere don't see these connections and relationships of things. Respectively, they act as if they don't exist. For them, reality is at each moment defined and determined by just one thing, by one number, and nothing else is important. One day it might be the number of infected, another the number of people on hospitals. The thousandth day it might be CO2 emission. Totality then may shift attention from one point to another, but only ever with one purpose in mind: to incorporate in itself and under its rule all in reality. And it will always use the same means. It shall proclaim that it is but one number, or a set of few numbers, that determines if your life is good or bad. But that just isn't the case. That which determines the experience of your life is all this combined, and not any number. And yes, the numbers do have some connection to reality. The numbers of the infected and the hospitalized, the illness which they have, all those do enter one's life and affect it. But they should do so in proportion to the experience of your life and in proportion to your own needs and fears. For when the attention is artificially and forcefully directed elsewhere than where it otherwise would, that is, at the things which a person in his experience of life perceives as important, the quality of the experience of life must necessarily get worse, because everything around one is slowly falling apart. If the illness was something that truly and completely determines the life of every person, then every person would give it all his attention naturally, without any pressure from the outside. But what do totality and left hemisphere do at this point? They just point at one number. X thousands of people died. Yes, they did. But what consequences will the current situation have? All the crumbling of reality around us and all the coming of totality? How many will die in the coming decades? What standard of life will we have? And what will the experience of such a life be? Will the life of millions be better because a few thousands get saved now, at this moment? When millions or hundreds of millions get pushed into poverty, into dependency on the totality and its structures, and all of that in a reality which is falling apart? How many victims can something like that claim? Will that be a better life? The goal of totality is to encompass within itself all, to rule and control all, to make everything dependent on it. If the currently chosen problem disappears, will the structures and ways of enforcing obedience disappear with it? Will totality give up the means of control over people which it gained over the last year and a half? Never. The means and the power which the system attributed to itself will remain in place and will be used for any other problem which will be deemed as one that needs all the attention. The only thing one can expect from totality is that when it perceives too great of a resistance, it will yield and take a step back, or that it will give people hope that the end of all problems is just around the corner. By doing so, it makes sure no one goes against it. After that, with a new wave, a new problem, it takes 2 steps forward. And no one will notice anymore that not all freedoms and options were returned to him. He will get accustomed to the new normal. The previous diagram can be redrawn from the point of view of an individual. And on the diagram, 2 ways of looking at reality will be seen. So, reality is inhabited by a person which, from his point of view, one, of an individual, has a completely unique and necessarily incomplete access to reality. Left hemisphere looking at the world will cut it up and disassemble it into the smallest object possible to which it can assign some symbol. And there it shall assign the thing its reality. And it has precisely the tendency to focus its attention on ever smaller and from all else ever more disconnected points. It's a sort of fractal process. One might picture it as follows. Many processes of many actors are going on in reality. Without the left hemisphere, we perceive all at once, that is, we have some qualitative experience of reality as a whole. The left hemisphere comes in and it starts to cut this whole into pieces. It will, for instance, identify an illness somewhere, and all else disappears from its vision. It looks closer and notices that if there is an illness, then there must be some ill people, and the ill can be represented by some graph, and each point of the graph can be defined by an explicit number. Reality has been replaced with its numeric representation, and this representation was elevated above all else and was made all-determining, because in its tendency to focus its attention on ever smaller and ever more out-of-context taken point, everything else stopped existing for the left hemisphere. And so, to a man, some display with the graph became reality. The pixels on the surface of the display literally became reality. Something inside one small frame literally became reality. In the end, one sees as truth only and precisely that which is on the surface, which is directly served to his senses, which no longer look through and beyond what they are seeing. The left hemisphere is putting a facade in front of our eyes, one that is meant to replace reality itself. But the right hemisphere doesn't lose the whole and true reality, that is, the reality of experience as a whole from its point of view. And so, if it is still sufficiently present and such a graph inside of a frame is presented to it, it looks through and beyond it. It looks whether it sees and experiences the numbers on the graph around itself to the degree to which it is being told it should. It looks at the sources of these graphs. It looks what other information these sources presented in the past. It looks whether this source was reliable in the past and what the real effects on one's experience of reality its actions actually had. It looks what information the source produced a year ago or half a year ago, and whether that information in the end corresponded to reality. It searches for other information and compares it to its own experience of the whole, to the state of the whole world as it sees it. It puts everything into context and asks a question. Are this one graph and this one number really the thing that describes and determines the whole of reality? And it compares all this to something greater yet, to the highest truth it is aware of. But this truth is not within reality, and it did not come from the outside, nor did it proclaim itself as sovereign and unchanging. Yet its place is above all else. It isn't above all in the sense that it would dictate to all what it must be. The direction is opposite. It is all the things inside of reality which determine the form of this truth. And this truth is that which is common to everything at the same time, into all the connections and relationships. Ultimately, this truth is common to everything that ever was, is, and will be. And it determines things inside reality only to the degree to which we are aware of it, and to the degree to which we make free decisions based on it. It is the truth, shape of which begins to be revealed to us when we ask the question, how should I act now, or in 50 years, or in 1,000 years, so that there is such a reality, experience of which would be the best possible not only for me, but for everyone else too, if I know what my experience and that of the others is now, in the current situation. So, what is really going on is not this one thing that our attention is focused on. It is no graph or number. It's the whole network of all things as they are connected to each other. But it wouldn't be left hemisphere or totality if it didn't say that this one thing, which is in conflict with this one, is not true, that it has no connection to anything, and that it really doesn't even exist. But how can, by its very definition, be truth something which doesn't take into account absolutely everything? And that is precisely what the left hemisphere is blind to. And so a sign of the left hemisphere is also the fact that it cannot understand what I mean by all this, what I mean by some higher truth. Because this whole and the higher truth cannot be expressed explicitly in any number of words, but only implicitly, because it rests in all things at the same time. And what is implicit and immune to separation just does not exist to the left hemisphere. The truth of some graph is limited to only the frame within which it is placed, but the whole truth is in the entire experience of the entire reality. Now that I have described what sort of principles drive the left hemisphere and totality, and how these principles lead to the current state of the world, and where they will lead next, one might arrive at a few conclusions. One of them is the pointlessness of trying to improve the state of things using the same principles which led to it. That is, by looking at the world as by numbers described and out of context pulled to pieces. Thus, there is very little point in arguing using statistics or numbers that contradict those the ruling structure pushes. That will lead nowhere, and such argumentation is the acceptance of the idea that there, after all, is a number somewhere that defines the world and life. Where such view of the world leads is starting to get followed by everyone. Such argumentation, if it, on the part of the left hemisphere, doesn't devolve into mere dereflection of attention elsewhere, from one number, 50,000 infected, to another, 90% effectivity, and so forth and back, can at best achieve that instead of two numbers, all the rules and restrictions will be based on 3. But be it as it may, I will present a few of these numbers and graphs that the existing structures don't like, because these numbers taken out of context do after all have a use. They should inform the free decision of each of us and not be an excuse for the state, which has clear totalitarian tendencies to enforce any mandates, especially in a situation where it is plainly and without pretense lying and ignoring an information which does not fit its scheme to expand its control over everything. The state is meant to work for its citizens, and it certainly should not meddle in anything which the citizens find controversial. I would even say that precisely because something is controversial, it ought not to be subject to the powers of the state or any such authority. However, the state, the coming totality, is through its actions and meddling into controversial topics already securing the approval of the majority with what it ultimately desires. For what else is creating mandates regarding controversial topics than state-supported division of society into groups in opposition to each other? What else is it than state, totality, taking for itself the power to call someone good or bad? Or in other words, to say who deserves to be rewarded and who punished. And this is done by the very same structure which has been knowingly pushing back some sort of threshold where things are supposed to change and where all problems are meant to be gone. And it is doing it using untruths and promises which, in the future, when it is clear they didn't come to fruition, it then denies it ever made. The goal of this process is nothing else than maintaining the impression that there is no need to act as individuals based on one's own deliberation. Because the by structure guaranteed solution from above is after all always around the corner. The point is to frustrate people to the point where the solution to the problem which the structure, the totality, wants is accepted by the great majority as the only possible one. The goal is, once the end of the problem is postponed by half a year yet again, for this great majority itself to demand that the already selected wrongdoers are punished from above. But now to a few of those numbers, statistics and facts which are just as taken out of context as those used in the propaganda, and which, although just as valid for the free choice of a person, are being ignored or proclaimed irrelevant or even mendacious. There is no evidence that any restrictions or lockdowns have any substantial effect on the evolution of the spread of the disease. PCR tests turn out positive in cases where the viral load is insufficient for any further transmission and infection. The viral load on mucous membranes of both medicated and unmedicated is the same. Study from Sweden has shown that the effectiveness of the medicine compared to a person who is not medicated against symptomatic illness is 0% after 6 months. And after 9 months, the medicated person actually has a higher chance of being symptomatic after contracting the illness. The same study shows that the effectiveness against severe illness is around 50% after 6 months, and it indicates that after 9 months, a portion of the medicated can expect to have more severe case than if they didn't receive the medication. Here, I can't but stop and wonder what the shape of this curve might be after repeated application of the medicine. Will it go down with each application, or will it remain at the same level? Is it possible that the immunity never returns after, say, 5 applications to positive values? Would it mean that those who had the medicine already applied are risking having to use it until the end of their life because their organism might never be able to sufficiently defend against the disease on its own? Would it then not be pragmatic, if one already had the medication applied, to stop after the first application and to accept, say, 20% chance of having more severe illness when the organism faces it again for the first time, rather than continue with the medications and risking 3 years down the road, missing the medication for whatever reason and then having potentially guaranteed severe reaction to the illness? Well, no one knows, because none of that was ever tested. But everyone should have the freedom to evaluate their own condition, their age, chance of being endangered by the illness, the state of the knowledge regarding the effectiveness of the medicines, and the freedom to evaluate the state of the world around them in order to make their own free choice based on all these considerations, without any pressure from above and without any punishment from above. The ratios of the infected and hospitalized, of the medicated and unmedicated, in the UK are, when recalculated as per 100,000 people, actually in favor of the unmedicated. Similar is the situation between these two groups even in numbers of deaths. And yes, in the UK, the mix of the used medications is a bit different than in other places, but the trend is quite similar to the one noted in the Swedish study. UK is about 2 months ahead in application of the medicine, than majority of other countries? Will the ratios of the two groups be the same there in January and February as they were in UK? In the months after the application of the medicine, the chance of getting a heart attack is doubled. Japanese bulletin warns that this medication that is recommended to everyone comes, for those in their 20s, with 7 times the risk of death compared to contracting the illness which it is meant to protect from. Spike protein created by the medication can enter the nucleus of the cell, and it interferes with the cell's ability to repair damaged DNA. This can lead to the development of cancer. Generally accessible statistics from all around the world show that the fatality rate after infection ranges, depending on the age group, from practically 0% to 10%, while in statistically significant danger are basically only people of the age of 65 and above. Vast majority of the hospitalized and dead are older than 65. For example, even if 100% of the Czech population younger than 25 got infected and none of them were medicated, there would only be a few deaths, much fewer than deaths that are in this age group caused by car accidents, for the use of which there are no restrictions being pushed and danger of which makes no one fearful. Statistical study of excess deaths in the USA came to the conclusion that up to 50% of all the deaths with the disease can be attributed to pneumonia, which was not treated by antibiotics. And it showed that the excess deaths compared to normal correlated strongly with the climate of the area, overall standard of living, and the level of obesity and general stress in the population, where the stress included medical, psychological, and social aspects. Being aware of this study, one can't but think about the often praised Sweden, success of which, despite no mandates having been implemented there, attributed to the conscientiousness of the population and to higher than average levels of medication. Isn't it though possible that the apparent success of Sweden is based precisely on the fact that it is a wealthy country with below average obesity levels in a population which is also under very little stress from the state and its mandates and restrictions? And isn't it possible, at least to a point, that the reason why we currently see the greatest waves of infected since the very beginning of the pandemic, even in countries with very high medication rate, is precisely the pressure and stress that the populations are subject to because of the state? Negative effects on the psychology of people and on the health of a society can be seen by everyone and no numbers are needed. Amount of information and proof about the ineffectiveness of the solutions that are pushed on us is now vast and continues growing. But the reigning totality has been clutching to the very same few numbers for almost 2 years now. Numbers it hasn't been able to do anything about at all. And so I must return to my own claim that the free decision of an individual, based on his truth, will long-term on average produce better results than any decisions or actions forced from the top, under pressure and based on untruths. Isn't it possible that without any pressure from the state, without any untruths and false promises, there would be much fewer of those who, just based on a principle, refuse to act in precisely the manner which the state demands? Isn't it possible that it is these now clear untruths and failed promises what strengthens people in their conviction that this authority is completely untrustworthy and that it is thus impossible to believe it? And what did make the other side believe that they had already made absolutely all for the resolution of the problem? Didn't the authority claim that nothing but just one act was the final solution for everything? If no pressure and no coercion were applied, if no unsubstantiated promises were made, no untruths told, if no restrictions were implemented just to create an impression of action and effort, wouldn't both groups now act more in accordance with reality? And wouldn't this now alternate reality be completely different to the one we find ourselves in? Regarding the keenly watched numbers of the dead, the infected and the medicated, we might very well be at the exact same spot. But the difference would be that no freedom would have been lost, and that no structures of tyranny would be in place, and that we wouldn't be artificially divided into the good and the bad. Not to contradict myself that much, one must admit and remind oneself that reality evolves, and with it even the idea of what is the truth. And so one might very well forgive the authority for taking wrong steps and for saying untruths. But one ought to then be reminded of another argument, that the left hemisphere, workings of which are blatantly apparent within the governments of the world, cannot, out of principle, see the whole truth, and that it has totalitarian tendencies. And one ought to return to another argument as well, that which is controversial in the population should in the first place not be for such an authority to decide. And after a year and a half of mandates, proclamations and promises, it is absolutely clear that vast majority of those was actually wrong, and that the predictions and opinions regarding the development of the situation of a regular person, and especially one that is now labeled as a conspiracy theorist, were much closer to the truth as we've seen it unfold. How is it possible that I have been in my own predictions 1 year into the future much more accurate than any government full of so-called experts? How is it possible that after 2 years of total failure and the inability to even guess any future developments, the governments across the world still have the arrogance to order their citizens how to act? How is it possible that the people still allow them to do it? While I, even now, after 2 years of almost flawless predictions, have not had the nerve to tell even one person in my vicinity how to act or what not to do. Why haven't I dared to tell anyone that I know better than them? Because I know that it isn't for me to decide for others, and because I know that only free personal decision leads long term to a better reality. While all of this will be, by totality which has already chosen its goal, brushed away as irrelevant and untrue. Because 90% effectivity and 50,000 infected a day. But as I have said, these are not the arguments to be used. At the end of the day, the only aspect determining the correctness of mandates, rules, and restrictions is the experience of life itself from a year ago as compared to the experience of today. And also the comparison of expectations for the quality of life's experience as based on the current state of things to the same expectation from a year ago. Is our life better now than a year ago? Are the things that actually matter better now than they were? Are our relationships and our experience of our lives better now? These are the things to consider when determining the correctness of what is happening across the world, not some numbers or graphs. So, yes, our attention focused on a few numbers maybe enabled us to save a few lives. But while it was focused on just one spot, much else fell apart. And much more fell apart than was built. And what was built is just another structure enabling more control over people. The consequence of this decay and this totalitarian establishment will be felt much longer and deeper than any consequences of free individual actions of everyone could ever be. Issues of totality and freedom aside, things gain their quality thanks to comparison. Something can be said to be large only at the moment something small exists that it can be compared to. Likewise, the quality of our lives is perceived the way it is thanks to comparison to something else. The inversion in our minds that I am talking about leads us to search for the meaning of our lives and for the quality of our lives in substitute symbols, in some explicit indexes. On one level, one can imagine by that a set of concrete material countable things. On another level, any parameters expressible in numbers. Money on an account, whatever index one cares to imagine, or perhaps something like a social score. The advantage of these indexes is of course that they can be purposefully manipulated and that quite straightforward and algorithmic paths lead to them. Which makes sense because out of necessity, they must be clearly defined. But from the point of view of experience and happiness of a man, they have the disadvantage that thanks to their explicitness, one can compare them very easily and to the entirety of the world at once. Moreover, these symbols are in a way permanent. Our inverted mind is then looking at our lives and sees them as defined by a set of things and numbers. Then it compares them to those it can see in the outside world. And because it can see both to the other side of the world and deep into the past, it necessarily concludes that the numbers and things defining our quality of life are somewhere out there, or even in our very past, higher, that is, better. And thus it finds our life as bad, and it believes that it will be better once the numbers are increased or once the material symbols are obtained. It can't but do so, and it will attempt to achieve those goals through explicit and algorithmic means. That is, with no regard to morality, with no regard to immediate experience of such a life. But how many people on the world can play such a game, where it is always necessary to have even more explicit and material things than everyone else? What proportion of them can have the feeling that their life is good? How would our experience of life look, and for what proportion of us could it be good, if the right hemisphere became the dominant one? The hemisphere which perceives all at once, directly, as it is in its essence. The hemisphere which looks only at the inner, the real experience of a man, one that is wholly individual and subjective, one which we can hardly compare to that from a month ago, let alone to one from 5 years ago, hardly to the one of the person dearest to us, even if he is physically right next to us, let alone to one of someone whom we don't even know and whom we can see only as pixels on display. Would the world perceived and created based on such view of reality be worse than the current one? Could a world based on how be better for humans than one based on what? I am obviously taking these ideas and issues that I'm presenting to their very limits, so as to paint a more contrasting picture of it all. And as such, I'm using the abilities and strengths of my left hemisphere. My goal here is not to claim that one aspect must be completely removed and replaced by another. To perceive and create reality, both aspects are necessary. They should inform each other, and neither should be too dominant or taking over the roles of the other. Then, in my opinion, we wouldn't be suspended in this inverted reality in which everything, including ourselves, has been atomized into a free-floating dust, which, in an artificial experience done for numbers and symbols, cut itself from natural and meaningful experience of life of a human as part of a whole. It is then paradoxical, yet not surprising, that this inverted mind of the contemporary human must find missing togetherness, meaning of life, and the sense of its goodness in the context of a reality built by the left hemisphere. Togetherness it has to find in joining those who separate themselves from others by identifying as in essence different. Meaning it must find in defending and expanding this through division against unity. And quality and goodness of life, defined by numbers and symbols, it must increase by lowering that of the others. But this process has already been described using more suitable words and concepts by someone else, Professor Matthias Desmet, whose words I shall try to quickly convey. Professor Desmet says that what is currently unfolding across the whole world is a mass psychosis, and that there are 4 prerequisites for it to emerge. First is the loneliness of people who lack meaningful and real bonds with others. Another one is the sense of meaninglessness of what one does, and in general, the feeling of the meaninglessness of one's own existence and life. The next prerequisite for emergence of mass psychosis is an aspect that follows from the first two, which is a sort of ever-present and all-penetrating, free-floating anxiety and discontent. Free-floating in the sense that no specific cause or originator can be assigned to it. The last aspect is, from this anxiety arising, frustration or even aggression. At a point where these prerequisites are met and some narrative appears, some story, that points its finger at some concrete perpetrator of this negative state of things, and which also offers the solution, the attention of the suffering populace is fixed on it. The attention of people gets completely fixed on one problem and one solution, and in turning to this narrative and clinging to the solution offered by it, the until then frustrated people find in it precisely what they lacked. being a part of a cohesive collective, and the presence of meaning in their life and their actions in the world. And because they gain these positive feelings thanks to the narrative, they will adhere to it no matter how absurd it gets, no matter how nonsensical behavior it will require of them. This behavior required of them by the narrative will take on the character of a ritual, where a ritual is a precisely given pattern of behavior which is void of any practical use or effect. It has a symbolic meaning and requires one to make a sacrifice. The more the ritual lacks any real effect towards solving the problem at hand, the greater sacrifice is required on part of the person, which paradoxically makes the ritual more powerful and for a person under the influence of the narrative more important to follow. For by submitting himself to such a ritual, he can better signal to his surrounding how great of a sacrifice he as an individual made for the good of the collective. The more absurd the ritual, the better it enables a man to demonstrate his devotion to his new religion, to his new collective, and to his new meaning of life. In a not too distant past, these prerequisites were met at the beginning of the previous century in Russia and in the 30s in Germany. In both cases, the mass psychosis developed and with it totalitarian regimes. While in the beginning, this mass psychosis enables people to find positive experience in finding again bonds with others and in finding again a higher meaning in one's life, long term, this process leads to the opposite, for it is riding on the back of a totalitarian view of the world. And about where totality leads and in what manner it works, I have already spoken. In this case, the process has the tendency to get stuck in a positive feedback loop. Ultimately, people will begin to feel ever more alone and atomized because totality, the moment it assimilates to itself or expels from itself the first group of perpetrators, will inevitably begin looking for the next group. And so it will have to divide itself, the whole, into two. It will find and identify another group of perpetrators, which is causing the still present problems, and once again it will have to reshape them to its liking or remove them. And like that, the totality will ceaselessly divide people into more and more groups until the individual will once again feel as though he belongs nowhere, that he is alone. He will again become an easier prey for the further influence of mass psychosis. This fight of totality against itself is one of the aspects that inevitably lead to its demise. And all these cycles, which have in the past caused hundreds of millions of deaths, could be stopped if totality, which always proclaims itself to be absolutely rational, actually did use its rationality to take its ideas to their final conclusion. That is, that the tendency to divide all into categories, to divide people into ever smaller classes and groups, must lead to just one division which makes sense: the division into individuals. For only a group the size of one person can be defined in a way that all its members do completely fit this definition. Such a group is then clearly not definable in any other way than by being of equal status to all others. That each individual has inherent and the same value as any other, that we are all one. And precisely in that, in our common belonging to one singular humanity, in our sameness in how different we are, in that we may find our unity and the bonds amongst ourselves, not in division into us and them. For several centuries, but it has been so especially in the last one, we are being told that reality and us ourselves are something which it is not, which we are not. At the very least, whole half of our very essence is being denied to us. And now we are at the point where it is demanded of the whole of humanity to make a pledge to this half-truth, to sign up to this inverted reality, to reality where it is numbers and symbols substituting real experience, what is to determine all, where it is not a free individual and his own experience, where it is not that which calls him to itself from within him and from without the borders of reality, that is to determine his decisions and actions in the world. Instead, we are to subscribe to reality, where that which determines all is something external to us, yet something which is itself within reality, and thus completely blind to the greatest potentials, completely blind to the experiences of all, and completely blind to the highest truth. Because the highest truth doesn't lie within any fragment inside of reality, but is common and belongs to all at once. It is beyond reality and above it. This reality, totality, we are meant to subscribe to, is based on a lie and is a lie. For what else is a lie than the idea that one center within all else is all and the whole truth? The trick that is being played on us is based on the knowledge that reality is in its essence built by free will, and on the knowledge that the highest motivation of most is fear. We are being told that it is possible to enter a reality where we can be completely safe and where we won't face any negative consequences for our own decisions and actions. And into this reality, we are meant to enter voluntarily, through a signature, through a ritual. Ritual through which we acknowledge that our minds and freedoms are no longer ours, but someone else's. That they belong to someone who is supposed to protect us from harm, both from the outside and from within our very selves. To someone who is meant to give us freedom in his fenced and clearly delineated garden. But this someone only demands total unconditional control over everything, and will be putting fences around everything and delineating absolutely everything until all has perfectly defined possible way of function, until freedom itself is completely removed, until everything is not but one unchanging crystal locked in space and time, controlled completely mechanistically by numbers, without experience, and from just one point. What I am talking about is these days obviously labeled as a conspiracy. But no conspiracies are even needed. What is going on is the inevitable consequence of mostly unconscious processes that drive actions of man without them being aware of them. And so it is rather the viruses of our minds that is governing the world, rather than conscious and aware individuals. But such individuals, of course, do exist, and they do act and channel the movements of humanity consciously towards their own ends. But even this acting of theirs is the result of the already many times mentioned inverted view of the world, the result of a conviction of one's own moral and intellectual superiority, and thus the result of self-appointed authority to decide about lives of others. When I speak of inevitability, what I mean is the necessity of going through this cycle of inverted view of the world and its inevitable end in totality. Various locations and civilizations have gone through this very cycle in the past, but now the conditions for the emergence of totality arose at the same time on more or less the whole world. Totality has never had better and stronger means of gaining control and of spreading its ideologies than it has now. Just because of that very reason, it is inevitable that it will use them. Because it simply has to do so, for it is in its very essence, in the essence present in our very own minds of this time. Now, we are in the phase when through fear we are herded into a system that is to become one meant to control and manage us all. Now it is about entering a system of control of every individual through explicit algorithms and numbers. And if the problem, because of which we are being forced into the system, goes away, a new one will be found. And it will be found for certain because the very functioning of this process ensures it. This process and totality, as I have said, focus their attention always only on one problem and one solution, which results in everything else falling apart. And if there is always something falling apart, there will always be the next problem that one will have to focus attention on. And the solution will always be that of moving more people and aspects of reality into the system of total control. And so the system which now controls and determines the standing of a person in society only based on his acceptance or non-acceptance of a medicine will necessarily be expanded by other aspects. What will crumble next? Perhaps the economy? How many of the people that are not scared of an illness will be scared by their inability to provide livelihood for themselves and for their family? How many of them will enter the system? And what parts of themselves will they have to give up? We can be certain that the scope and speed of gaining control, the speed of totality's emergence, can be thanks to the possibilities of this day's interconnected and technological world, plagued by all present lack of meaning and anxiety, until now unseen. But within that also lies the greatest hope. Yes, historically, the greatest proportion of people will be faced with the worst conditions possible, the fastest in history. Simply put, greater proportion than in any other time or in any other place in the past will face such experiences that can help them become aware of the existence of the virus in their very minds and of the divide between good and evil, as Solzhenitsyn said, in their very own hearts. And so the coming totality has the potential to be also the one of the shortest duration. But one thing is sure, it will last the longest, if they survive, for those who saw it coming first. And it will be the shortest for those who decided to use it for their own benefit, and for those who entered it as the first ones to find safety, and for those who thought they would gain freedom from responsibility and from the consequences of their own actions, thinking it would take those over from them. One can't but repeat that the solution to all this is in giving the individual back his ability to act in the world based on his free choice. The solution is local and in communities of people who know each other. While no individual truly knows himself, he does know more of himself than of anything else. He might have a fairly good idea of what is good for his family. He might have a claim on an opinion or even influence about how his neighborhood or maybe a small village should work, but he certainly can't see into the whole city or into the state. Conversely, the state might see into counties or cities, but it certainly sees into no streets or into families, no matter how much it tries, and it most certainly can't see into an individual. Both extreme points of the spectrum, the individual and some highest point of some structure, see elsewhere and should also have their own sphere of influence. Above all, it seems, it was forgotten that these structures are meant to be built from the individual up and that they are meant to serve the individual, not the other way around. The solution then is a sovereign individual who doesn't do what he knows to be bad for him and for the others. And if we all acted in such a manner, reality would immediately, within a second, reorganize itself and by itself into the best possible configuration. Nearly nothing of the material would have even to change, because ultimately it is how we act, the intentions with which we act, and the values according to which we act, that determines the quality of experience of everyone the most. The epidemic that we are really facing here is not one of some illness, but one of inverted minds, of exaggerated need for safety and comfort, of exchanging experience of reality for numbers and symbols. It is an epidemic of emphasizing the explicit rather than the implicit, of emphasizing hollow, basic physical needs, here and now, detached from any deeper meaning. It is an epidemic of disconnecting oneself from the idea of something greater, from a potential that can yet be fulfilled, that can give us the courage to step into the darkness within ourselves, into the darkness beyond the borders of what we know. It is an epidemic of fear. And fear is, as I see it, one of the two main motivations of people. It is here that I return to the beginning of this polemic, where I mentioned in what way I am losing my freedom and my free choice. And to explain that, I must put all the current happenings into the biggest frame I am aware of. Until now, most of the ideas and thoughts were within that which is reality, and I was pointing at the ways of looking at reality and ways of acting within it, which I perceive to be at this time dominant and leading to degradation of man's experience within it. And all my accusations were more or less aimed at the tendency to not entertain the possibility of existence and the possibility of it having effect on the experience of man, of that which is undefinable explicitly by numbers, of that which is not within physical reality. Then the largest frame into which our experience can be put does, in my opinion, include even that outside of by our senses perceivable physical reality. Where physical reality is then what is perceivable by our senses, made of explicit, dividable manifestations of an idea that can be defined and assigned numbers. Where physical reality is literally being created by the reduction of multitudes of potentials into precisely one possible manifestation, that being done through a free will choice. This reality is then experienced, its quality is experienced, and an idea of some greater potential, the shape of some higher truth, towards which future choices should lead, is updated. The purpose of physical reality is, from my point of view, for it to become an experienceable manifestation of the greatest possible order of things. And this highest truth and greatest possible order are always outside physical reality and are of always evolving form. Physical reality, seen like that, should then grow from the bottom, through the action of an individual, upwards, to meet up with this higher ideal superior to physical reality, in the sense that this idea is informed by the experience from within reality and is created in unison by all who experience it. As such, the whole of reality would have a clear directionality, to get from what is, always lacking, with potential of being better, towards something that yet is not, and the experience of which is better than the current one. And to these two possible directions, away from and towards something greater, one might assign the two basic and opposite motivations: fear and that which can be best described as love. Love also being synonymous with the highest possible truth. The truth that will always lay outside of physical reality, one that is also constant across all past and present, and that shall remain constant even into the farthest, greatest possible future. Without laying out the whole thought process, this constant truth, it seems to me, does look like a process in which two basic and contradictory aspects of reality always come together and join in one point. And such a process I would hardly call anything else than precisely love. Fear I would then define as a movement towards making everything different from the self, arriving at its own future. In practice, that means the tendency to make everything be the same as the self, or to remove everything different from the self from perception, from reality, to completely disconnect oneself from it. Love, to describe it in the same sense, would then be the tendency to find one common and interconnected future for all, despite all the existing differences, and without trying to remove all these differences. In other words, love is minimized when everything is the same and divided, unconnected, because to love the self, or that which is the same as the self, requires the least love. Fear means movement away from something, and so it must be away from something already existing within reality, but also towards something that is already extant and in the essence the same as the self which is motivated by fear. Love means movement towards something that is greater than that which already exists. That is, towards something that it isn't and that requires something to become real through the act of connection with something different than the self this way motivated. From this it follows that whether we see something as good or bad depends on whether it moves us in the same or the opposite direction that we ourselves are oriented towards. Logic and pure rationality, as they have no directionality, can then, towards their own goals, deduce things in any self-consistent way they desire. And I am of the opinion that we are living in a time when about 1/3 of humanity is motivated by love and 2/3 by fear. But I am certainly not saying that 2/3 decide wholly based on fear and 1/3 purely based on love. What I am saying is that 2/3 decide in more aspects of their lives more based on fear than on love. 2/3 then, on average, get to greater potentials necessarily through the escape away from something that already exists and that can be experienced. And that is where the inevitability of the current happenings in the world comes from. Most of us are simply incapable of going towards something better by ourselves, of our own hearts. So we must be pushed there by a negative experience of reality, which we must be able to assign to our own decision. So if we are getting towards greater potentials and better versions of reality through love, which requires a subject other than the self to connect with it, and if it requires some idea of something greater which is outside of reality, then one can see humanity as dual in another sense. Those motivated more than love do then have within themselves, within their hearts, more than there is in the reality around them. What they have is precisely the idea of something greater, and they have the urge to manifest it inside of reality. Those more motivated by fear have less within themselves than there is in the reality around them, and they have the urge to fill this hole within by something inside of reality. Those motivated by fear have the need to contain within themselves, to taste, the external reality to fill the void within. Those motivated by love have the need to expand reality so that it matches the surplus within them. But both motivations, at their best, work always united at the very same edge of reality where potentials are turned real. It is the imbalance in this process, which I imagine should be fixed thanks to the coming experience awaiting us in the near future. The nature of this imbalance is that one aspect is dominant to the other, and that both aspects stop working with and searching for fulfillment in the other. Only now do I get back to the perception of what it means to have freedom. The steps of a man motivated by the highest truth, absolute love, will within reality be determined precisely by this highest truth. And the higher this truth and the awareness of it, the more actions within reality will be the more determined. Such a man, until he subscribes to this truth within him and outside of reality, will see his freedom as existing precisely outside of reality, in his own mind and heart, in the possibility to explore any and all ideas and potentials. As much more is available to him there than in physical reality. From his point of view, he himself is the one who is the originator of his freedom, for it is within him, and it seems to him impossible that he would ever deny himself of it. And such a man will lose his freedom through his own decision. He will enslave himself to a higher truth, which will then determine his steps within reality, but also allow him to take steps within it burdenlessly, steps which he would until then never take. And through that, he will paradoxically gain the freedom to freely act within reality. Steps of a man motivated by fear will be determined by a negative experience of something within reality. Such a man lacks something within himself and outside of reality that would determine and limit his possible steps and actions within reality. Thus, the amount of actions and steps available to him inside of reality is almost limitless. It is enough that they lead in a direction away from something perceived as negative, and they can lead towards any pleasure at hand, and they can get in any way possible. Such a man will then perceive his freedom in the possibility to move about physical reality freely, enacting within it in any way he pleases. That is, without being restricted by anyone else or anything else. For him, the originator of his freedom is the amount of actions, activities, and experiences available to him. Such a man will lose his freedom through the decision of another, through a decision from the outside, from where he never expected it. Or he will lose it by voluntarily committing to a stable state of things within the reality around him. And as he loses his ability to act within and move about physical reality, he will find out that the only place that now affords him and allows him some freedom is within himself, outside of reality, in the only place where totality can't reach. The hell and the test to one will be having to face the emptiness within him, for he will no longer be able to fill it by acting within reality and through experiencing it boundlessly. The hell to the other will be the experience of a to him repugnant reality, which will tempt him to throw away his higher truths and principles, acting according to which will have the potentially highest physical consequences. Both these men of opposite motivations will find freedom where they didn't care for it and are then forced to meet again at one spot, at the edge of reality. One will get there by having to start taking action. The other will get there because he will have to fill the void within him with love. And that is where reality will continue on when the totality begins to fall apart. And it will continue to yet another cycle. I have already talked about what the ritualistic entrance to the system of coming totality is. And after having said all this, it should be clear that he who has already entered into it is neither good nor bad. He was simply more motivated by fear than love. Or he simply believed he would be able to keep his freedom to move and act within physical reality without restrictions. Conversely, he who refuses to enter it is also neither good nor bad. The decision each of us made will simply bring us to the experience of precisely that which we need to experience in order to correct our shortcomings. We will all lose freedom, everyone his own, and our test will be to find it on the other side. No one only listened to orders, no one did only that which he was told to do, no one had to do anything. Sufficiently back in the past, every one of us made his own and free decision that led to what is happening and to what is emerging. And every single one of us will feel such consequences that will confront him with his greatest weakness, and every single one of us will be responsible for them. The purpose of these consequences and experiences will be to arrive at some higher truth, to realize that what we consider to be the truth now is not it. Free decision, experience of the consequence, achievement of greater potential. That's the only and infinite loop of all, one that leads us to the highest truth. I'm sitting here and talking here like an absolute nobody. But it's probably also my biggest strength. Because as a nobody, I don't have anyone above me who has any expectations of me, so I can talk about anything I want. But in a way, that's also my biggest downside. Because as a nobody, I have no authority. So whatever I say probably has very little value to anyone. But based on what I said previously, that shouldn't even matter. Because no authority should be able to say what is true or not. It's you and what you know is right that matters. So when I'm talking here and you feel as though I'm talking some truths, it doesn't matter that some authority says it isn't so. The only thing that matters is what you know. And you should act based on what you know, not based on something that I am saying is true or some other authority says is true. You know, I've also been talking about the inevitability of all of this happening. By the inevitability, I mean above all the need for division. Because it is through division, when we get away from something, that we can actually better know ourselves as well. And I have experienced in my very life that as I get to know myself better, I also get to know others better, and I stop seeing them as different, but more as the same as me. And so, paradoxically, as I, in my previous life, got detached from the world and others, and managed to get to know myself better, I also then could appreciate others more and see them more as being the same as me than different. And I think that's probably ultimately the greatest realization humanity is to gain from the experiences that are coming. That we are actually more the same than different. And once we know that, we will actually be able to come together again, to connect, and to find love. So, thank you for listening to me.